Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. Since 2004, we've been running over 30 years events a year, bringing councils and the development community together. And for the last month, everything we do has seemed pretty trivial in comparison to more people dying in London than during the Blitz, and truly tragic numbers across the country and around the world. We're contributing 10% of our revenues to the Do Some Good campaign, but other than that, we don't have any life-saving skills at 3Fox. What we do have is an opportunity to play a small role in helping the economy towards recovery. And by keeping the conversation going between the public and the private sectors in the development community, we're hoping to play that small part. We're doing that by hosting webinars every week during lockdown. And next Thursday, we're going to be hosting another, which will be turning our attention outside London for once, asking what does recovery look like for the core cities? And I hope you'll be able to join us again for that. But today's topic is how can councils help tackle construction challenges post-COVID-19? When our research highlighted this as an area of interest, I was intrigued because my understanding is that councils don't have a great deal to do with construction sites directly. But of course, councils represent about 40% of the construction sector's turnover, and construction provides about 10% of UK jobs. And with about 65% of UK sites closed by value last month, although that figure is down to about 37% more recently, I think, I for one am very interested to see how this conversation turns out. And the conversation wouldn't be happening at all if it wasn't for our sponsor today, Wilmot Dixon. Without exception, it's been a great pleasure for us at 3Fox to work with Wilmot Dixon on a number of projects over the years. It's a company, in my experience, that's made up entirely of good people. And I'm delighted to welcome one of them to our panel today, Chris Tredgett, Managing Director for the company's London and East operation. Alongside Chris, it's a real pleasure to spend some time with some old friends, including Keith Ferry, who is the Deputy Leader at Harrow Council. Hello, Keith. Pat Hayes, the Managing Director of Be First. Morning, Pat. And it's particularly lovely, thanks Pat, it's particularly lovely to be working for the first time today with the stewards of Our Manor at Croydon, where our office is based. You remember those offices? Strange things from the past, maybe one day the future again. But anyway, very warm welcome to Shifa Mustafa, the Executive Director of Place at Croydon Council. Hi, Shifa. Our programme this morning is going to start in a couple of minutes by setting the scene. We're going to ask each of our panellists to spend 5 minutes describing the scale of building work in which they're involved and the impact of COVID-19 on that activity. And we're going to get a sense of the importance and significance of that activity. And then at about 20 past, I'm going to ask Chris to talk a little bit about the challenges that contractors face following the new guidelines to get building sites operating from this week, and suggestions as to how councils might help with that. And then we'll ask for responses from our other panellists before moving on to a Q&A session. All the way through this session this morning, we'd be delighted if you, the viewers, could use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens if you're looking on a computer or laptop, to put questions to our panel and to vote for the questions that you'd most like to be asked. And we'll respond to the most popular of those questions from about 11:45 onwards. We'll also be running several polls throughout this session and an exit survey, so they'll pop up onto your screens. And if you can complete them as they appear, your responses will form part of our report from this session. And that'll be made available to you through social media and alongside a video of the session today on the voiceofauthority.co.uk website. And then at midday, we'll bring the session to an end and you can get on with your next Zoom call, no doubt. So let's get to the meat of the subject. I'm going to start with Chris Tredgett at Wilmot Dixon and ask Chris to give us an overview of the scale of building operations that Wilmot Dixon are involved with and the effects of COVID-19 on those. Chris.
Toby, thanks for that. I suppose before I go into that too much, I think we have to say that COVID is a very real threat to our people, their families, and it's also a very real threat to business and balancing the people need and the business need has been a real, I suppose, test of leadership over the last, I think it's 55 days, is it, since Boris made that announcement. So that has been, in many ways, the biggest challenge is trying to balance the need of people and the economy. Wilmot Dixon, one of the largest privately owned construction businesses in the UK, we turn over 1 billion a year, across probably 75 to 80 projects on the ground at any one time. In my region, we turn over circa 180 million. I've got 18 live projects on the ground and 20 projects in pre-construction at the moment. And all those are being worked on by people that now work from home. So that's one of the first challenges, if you like, of this new normal that we have, is that, you know, we've had to move everybody out of our 20,000 square foot office to be working from home. That said, I've come into the office today because I needed to be absolutely sure of the internet link, so that I didn't suddenly disappear in the middle of this. In terms of the effect of COVID on the business, in those first days following Boris's announcement, the activity on site plummeted, and I have figures that show that, you know, some of our sites went from having 120 people down to 30 overnight. So a lot of people did not have clarity that first day following Boris's announcement, and in fact, I had a sleepless night thinking, what are we doing tomorrow? How are we going to take this forward? And you know, I got up early and read the guidance, because I needed to be able to say to my teams and communicate with my teams, actually, this is what the message was. There was a message, a verbal message given by Boris, but the actual detail says this, and this detail says the construction industry should go to work. If you can't work from home, you should go to work. So we then had to take the challenge of working out what does that mean? What does that mean on a construction site? What does social spacing mean on a construction site? And also, how do you get to work? How do you get to work safely? And how do our people work? So there was massive challenges, and a lot of those challenges were really about communication and about putting new processes and procedures in place that ensured that our people and our supply chain and our customers could visit our sites safely and continue to work in a controlled and safe manner. That was a challenge. That was a huge challenge, certainly in the first few days, whilst we rapidly rethought our processes and procedures and put in and risk assessed and put in place processes to do things at the same time as our supply chain resource plummeted. A number of the supply chain actually then within the week started to return. Others had taken another step, which is they'd seen the furlough opportunity, if you like, and furloughed their people for the initial 3-week period. So we saw a very quick drop off in activity, and actually quite a rapid comeback. And certainly once that initial 3-week period gone, and we'd spoken to all our supply chain saying, come and see our sites, you know, come and see what we're doing, come and see the control that we have in place. And then we were able to, you know, to start to pick things back up from there. So there's the challenges on site, and then there's the challenges in pre-construction with new projects. There's been a considerable stuttering of activity in pre-construction because parties that we work with or for have closed down or reduced activity. So local authorities had to go through processes as we did to work out how you continue to operate. Things like building control and other legislative bodies were no longer available, and certain statutory authorities also packed up shop. So considerable challenges in many areas. I think, Toby, I'll probably go into a bit more detail a bit further on, but you know, for me, the biggest challenge of the initial crisis was actually around our leadership and how we kept our people engaged. And you know, one of the hardest things was actually, in some respects, continuing to work whilst the press and people's attitudes really challenged by the circumstances.
Yeah, so it was a difficult time, Chris. As I understood it, I was told that by one construction firm that because of the bad press that contractors were getting by continuing to work on site following government guidelines, all their social media was closed down because they were just being attacked incessantly on social media.
Absolutely.
Was that the case with you guys?
Absolutely, yeah. No, it was very, very difficult. We went through a period where certain people were twittering and attacking us as a business and other construction businesses for continuing to work in accordance with government guidelines. And I can't say everything in the whole world was perfect, but we had to adapt very rapidly to an important situation. You said earlier, construction depends on numbers you take, but it's 15% of GDP. It is a vitally important lifeblood of this industry, of this country, and it's really, really important.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot for that, Chris. Keith, being vilified by the public online, on social media, it sounds very much like the politician's life. So some of that must resonate with you. But going on to looking solely at the kind of construction focus of this webinar, has what Chris has said, did that resonate through Harrow? What kind of scale of operations are you involved with, and how were they affected by COVID-19?
I think most of our construction companies carried on working throughout the period from the 23rd March onwards. As Chris has said, some were unsure whether they were supposed to work or not. We've currently got a construction project on to build an office block at our depot, and we didn't know whether we should be taking the lead or not by closing that down. But we were very much waiting for government guidance on that. And as government guidance never came forward, we're still wondering whether we should have shut it down or whether we haven't. But during that 2 months period, it's come on leaps and bounds. We've got quite a massive regeneration program in Harrow for the council. Our present civic centre is based in a fairly large site that has about 600 car parking spaces around it. So over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been planning to demolish that, build a new civic centre first, hopefully, and then demolish our civic centre and put 1,200 dwellings on the present site. We've also got a leisure centre that has a large car park, and we've been doing similar things with that. I think what's happened over the last 2 months is that we've really had to rethink what we're going to do, because we've had a survey done, and I have to point out that over the last 2 months or so, the way that councils have worked has changed tremendously. It's a sort of change that we couldn't have envisaged if we'd have given 3 or 4 years to plan for it. We're now involved in things like distributing food, distributing grants to small businesses, and we've also changed, like everybody else, the way we work. We've all discovered Zoom, we've all discovered Teams, we've all discovered how to sit at home and not feel guilty that we're not at work, and do other things like that. So our present thinking is that the civic centre that we were going to build, and probably will still build, instead of accommodating 980 people, will now accommodate 280 people. So that's a third reduction in the size, 2/3 reduction in the size of the building that we require. And I think this is going to knock on into the future as well, because certainly people that are constructing offices may well have to come back and redesign those offices. I think there's still going to be a need for offices, but I don't think there's going to be the same need for people to come to an office to do their work every day. I think, the idea of serviced offices where somebody could just pop in for an hour or two and do a bit of printing or scanning or use an office machine might become more of the normal, so that we're not only going to be, we're going to be sharing offices, I think, rather than having dedicated offices. So I think that's something that we have to look out for in the future. Coming back to what councils can do, we've got an economic development team that have been very active in the construction industry locally. We've got something like 200 apprentices that pass through the system, and we'll be looking to enhance that as much as we can. As you know, I'm also in charge of economic development, planning and regeneration. So I think our planning system is going to have to be a bit more flexible based on the fact that, as I said, people that are now constructing buildings may well find that the end use of that building is not suitable or viable anymore, and that they would like to come back and change it in somewhat. And of course, when you're in the middle of construction or even at the start of construction, any delay in the planning system while we look at a change of use or a different orientation of a scheme is going to have a massive impact on the amount of time that you lose on that particular project. Building control is also, we're still carrying on with building control, but that is going to become more difficult, I think, in the future as well. But the things that we can really do is that we would like, and in Harrow we've been doing this for many years, we would like developers to come and talk to us, to tell us what their problems are. We know the macro problems, but we want to know what you're having problems with. For instance, the announcement that building sites can operate until 9 p.m. is going to cause a certain amount of problems with the local residents. Mm-hmm. But then we've got ward councillors, we've got at present 3 councillors in each ward who know their patch, who have been there for many years. They know the people involved. They can offer advice to get over the problems of engaging with the local population. And of course, we have always had links with the police, the NHS, the fire brigade, community organisations, and we would welcome developers to come along and let us help them with those links. So that's what I think we can do, but I'm going to be very interested to hear the other side. I've also been in construction for 50 years, so I know roughly what's coming forward, but I'd like to hear the details from other people.
Great stuff, Councillor. Thank you very much. And I'm sure Chris will pick up on some of those points when we come back to him shortly. Pat, when we spoke last month, you were talking about the sort of exodus of subcontractors back to their homes elsewhere in England, many in the north of England, when lockdown hit. Has that picture changed at all in Barking and Dagenham?
Yeah, I mean, the picture is changing, and I think it will continue to change. I think one of the things that I'd say about this whole situation is that I think the UK was late to respond, and we've now got to a degree catch up, and we've got to think, and start thinking now very much how we plan for the future and for coming out of the pandemic, which will bottom out to a degree over time. And I think at the moment, it's important that we don't make too many assumptions about what will happen, and that, the office market is dead, the retail market is dead, or the retail market is brilliant, the office market is brilliant, because we just don't know at this stage. And I think that for me, the important thing was that you could see what was going to happen. I mean, I happened to be in Milton Keynes the day that first person died in the hospital in Milton Keynes, and you think, well, you can see what's happened in other parts of Asia and other parts of Europe. This is coming our way, so that we did lots of things then to start to really predict where this was going based on where other people were. So we've got COVID clauses in all our contracts, which we managed to get in place by the end of the year, which has been really useful for us, and we're able to take a fairly clear view on moving our staff very rapidly. And I think the industry was actually very good in terms of being ahead of the government in getting people to start working from home. If you looked at a lot of the major players in the industry, even whether it's around MIPIM or not, people decide, no, we're not going to MIPIM because it's clearly not right for our employees. And now the government was still vacillating at that point in terms of advice on foreign travel and all these sort of things. So that I think, I think we felt that at that point we were at least, keeping up with where we were. And the view was, and clearly all our contracts, and we're a major house builder effectively, we're building 500 units a year. 3,000 units over the next few years. That in our contracts, responsibility for health and safety is very clearly with the contractors. However, we want to be a responsible contractor, and just as my first priority is always the health and safety of my employees in be first in the council. Obviously, we're also very concerned about the employees, the people who are working for us. And I think, therefore, the next stage was to see, well, can we keep some of this going? Clearly, there was contradictory advice. Government sort of laissez-faire position, construction can carry on. The mayor obviously very concerned about loading on the underground system particularly, but on the public transport network generally, advocating shutting down GLA, directly operated projects, which created an issue for us, definitely, in terms of trying to sit almost between the two. I think probably the mayor was probably morally right, and it remains to be seen what the long-term health impact of keeping construction going was or is, and whether it's significant or not. But and at that point we saw, some contractors stopped work, I think quite rightly. Others carried on. I think, as I said a couple of months ago, it's part of that which is the nature of the work that was involved. The sites of our 8 major operational sites, 5 have kept going. Nearly all of those are at external stage, so demolition, groundworks, where it is relatively easy to keep people apart from its sort of socialising time. And there has been a significant reduction in output, but those sites have kept working. From the 1st of June, we should be back to 10 sites operating, as sites that were in the pipeline are actually going to start. As you say, we did have an initial problem with quite a lot of subcontracted jobs in our MMC project, where staff were down here staying in hotels and digs and things like that, and quite understandably went home. They've, our MMC manufacturers reconstructed their processes so that they can work safely and continue to supply units and deliver units. And some of our other subcontractors have come back on site. And so we've now got work going forward. The challenge for me now is, as we have more work on site, I need to have more of my people supervising that work. So the moment, a big part of my day yesterday and a big part of my day for the rest of today is around drafting that guidance in terms of reassuring our staff we're not going to make people go back, but these guys are going to go back because we need to monitor these sites, and this is the process that we follow. This is who will go. So we're looking at who doesn't have to use public transport, who's not in a vulnerable group, etc., etc. Some people are very willing and want to go back. So where there are volunteers, that's appropriate. Some people want to go back into the office, but that's not an option at the moment, because again, I don't think we feel that that's necessary or desirable to have people travelling around London. And we've got to be doing our part for a broader public health agenda, not just for our ease or operation. And we're in the lucky position that we can operate, our organisation is operating very effectively and arguably more productively with everyone working from home. We had 2 people sick with Covid-19. Since they've recovered, we've had no one off sick. A lot of staff are getting through a lot of work, and the problem we're having is telling people to shut your computer down and don't work 10 hours a day, because it's too easy to do that at home. So there are some organisational, operational issues, staff management issues, but our programme is on site and advancing. I think the challenge for us now is what we can do to intervene and help keep the broader construction pipeline going, because the house builders are clearly taking a hit at the moment, because house sales have pretty much stopped. There is some people doing online viewing, I believe, but very, very limited. Confidence in the investment sector is very, very low at the moment. Obviously, that one hopes will come back. We had quite a lot of marginal sites, a lot of sites that have been sitting whilst people were either trying to get vendors or raise the funding to bring them forward. And we're now looking very hard, what can we do to help bring those sites forward? If it's us buying them, us JVing with the owner, are there other things that we can do? At the sort of micro level, we've continued to operate a very limited building control service. I think one of 5 London boroughs that are still doing inspection to a degree. And we're going to keep on and expand that, so we can keep some of the small builders in the borough going, who are doing essentially domestic work, where we can inspect that safely when it's outside, not in people's homes or homes that are occupied, etc. So at the very micro level, we're trying to support and help the the local small building sector by keeping building control going. At a more macro sector, we're looking at how can we intervene, whether it's turnkey purchase, whether it's JV, whether other mechanisms to help keep the house builders and other developers moving forward. That's a big issue for us in terms of very active discussion now at a London-wide level through London councils and others with Homes England and the GLA. For how can the public sector now intervene to keep construction moving forward? I think in 2007-8 recession, we saw that the government's response to that was to put money through the private sector, which I don't think necessarily was a particularly good use of that resource in terms of the bang for the buck, as the Americans would say. And though I think some of that may be necessary, really the opportunity here to put money through the public sector to galvanise the construction sector and also to help the private house building and development sector along. I think it is always very important. I think where public money is directed, and we've seen whether it's some of the programs to encourage first-time buyers and things like that. You do think that value isn't necessarily there of the amount that goes in. And in this instance, this may be a big opportunity through putting money through the public sector to really increase the supply of affordable housing quickly. That's exactly what was done after both the First and Second World Wars, interestingly, which again, those similar sort of periods of effectively economic stagnation due to an external factor. So that's where we are. I think in terms of looking forward, it is the challenge, I think, will be to find safe ways of working over the next few months. If there is a second, or it may well be the third wave, depending on one's view of when this actually started, of high-level infection, how we cope with possibly another shutdown for a period, and then a restart, and then how we make up for lost time in our existing programme and how we help the sector recover longer term into next year.
Lots of threads to pull on there, Pat. Thank you very much. And two public sector bodies, albeit Be First is a private company. Two public sector bodies that are really keen to engage and intervene and support the construction and development industries. Shifa, is that the case also in Croydon, where I'm witness on a daily basis to buildings shooting up left, right, and centre? And what level of activity has there been during the COVID crisis?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Toby. You only need to arrive at Croydon and you will be welcomed by a number of cranes. So a little bit about Croydon to start with. So Croydon, obviously, one of the largest London boroughs, very much a growth borough. We have a regeneration programme where the value is estimated to be around 5 billion. And specifically in relation to construction at the moment, as of last week, so that was before Boris's recent announcement, we had 35 sites, construction sites. Of those, 2/3 were continuing. And I'll just give you a bit of flavour of the types of developments, because these are very large developments. We've got an office or a retail development right opposite our offices, which is currently constructing 500 units, and they have just carried on. We've got the tallest modular development, this is bang opposite East Croydon Station as you come out, tallest in the world, 44 stories, that's modular, and that's very relevant to this whole challenge around supply of materials because it's done differently. And they too are continuing and are due to finish in August. And then we've got another one, which is probably the biggest development on site at the moment in Queen Square. And this is international, in fact, Chinese developers, where the first phase involves 300 residential units. It is mixed use, but certainly by the time you get to phase 2 and phase 3, we're talking thousands and probably several thousands square foot commercial space as well. Now, interestingly, they have stopped. So we've got a sort of a number of scenarios going on in Croydon. In addition to that, what's happening interestingly is since the COVID lockdown, we've had 2 announcements about new developments in Croydon, quite major. One, a relocation of some government offices, again, several thousand square feet, and another one, a new university presence. Now, in terms of the impact, what I've been doing, I've literally been phoning around all the big developers and saying, what's happening? What do you think is going to happen? Are you still on track? If you're not, what are you worried about? And got some interesting responses, really, because the first thing that's probably common with all of them is they've said, the ones that are on track said, yeah, we're on track. Challenges are around, obviously, materials, because the supply chain is changing and in some cases drying up. they've got some huge issues around the new ways of working. So where construction is continuing, this whole thing about social distancing, the timescales are slowing down because they can't have as many staff on site. They did talk about staff shortages, but only in relation to the, if you like, the final bits of construction, where you get the finishing and the specialist piece, and that has, of course, an issue around labour and supply. But the bigger, more strategic thing really is the thing about, and it's interesting about which ones continue, which ones stops. And the big thing, of course, is viability. And what does that now mean for our schemes? And interestingly enough, on the university and the government offices, the reason why they're confident and they are saying they are going to start on site is because they have a very clear end user. So the viability challenge isn't there. And they've got a very clear timescale. So the university needs to be open the academic year September 21, and the government office needs to be completed by 23. So they're actually gearing up to start on site. So these are new ones coming in, and they're saying because they've got the clarity of end user, they're going to carry on, and they're carrying on to plan. And thinking about the actual challenges, which is labour force and new ways of working, and not the viability one. Whereas the ones that have stopped, like the Chinese developers, they're saying actually we need to make sure we're going to sell these units before we carry on. You know, how is the market changing? So that's a bit of a general overview of the picture and the impacts. I mean, I know we're going to go on to this, but I think there's actually quite a lot councils can do. And I think I agree with what Councillor Keith Terry said earlier about how councils have, because of COVID-19, started to do things they've never done before, which includes influencing supply chains. We have done so much work buying PPE, never done before by a council. Why would we be doing things like that? And actually discovering new supply chains and new ways of influencing them. So I think there are some very short-term things councils can do, and indeed we are doing. You know, I've just been looking at some of the questions about how do people get into work. We've done so much around parking provision. We've done so much around enforcement provision. My inbox is full of complaints about why our own company, Brick by Brick, is continuing to work and they're not socially distancing. What am I going to do about it? So there's lots of short-term things we can do. But there's also things we can do the more medium term about those relationships with suppliers, about confidence and about viability, because I think, as Pat alluded to, and I think this will happen more and more, is where you do have certainly residential schemes that have got stuck because of the viability, who's going to buy them. Councils could come in and say, actually, we'll have them and we will use them for affordable housing. And that is happening in Croydon anyway, and we could escalate that. I think there's also something councils can do around priming, around starting to spend our own money. And again, I think Pat alluded to that. So you get the public sector capital programme coming into play, which we can influence, because that helps, again, build the critical mass and helps with some of these things around supply of labour, but also materials. And I also think the big thing is about the future. And, you know, I do believe that because of what's happened with COVID, we are going to have to restructure the economy. And if anything, I think what it will probably do is it will actually accelerate what we were starting to work towards before around this whole notion of smart cities, as in environmental factors now changing, technology changing. And I think this really will mean that we're going to have to fast track that whole restructuring of our economy and how that looks in the future. And it was always there, but I think it now means that we're going to have to, and we've learned a lot, I think, in the last few weeks about COVID and how we live and the impacts on the environment and technology and everything else. And I think this will mean that we're going to have to fast forward some of those. But I think in the short term, the absolute eye will be on the economy, because that's what we've got to, I think, respond to next.
I think that's absolutely right, Shifa. Thank you very much. And there's this phrase that keeps coming up during the pandemic about fast forwarding, how it's fast forwarded so many different processes that were kind of slow or happening in the background. And I think that's definitely the case. You've got so many schemes happening in Croydon that you can't even list them all. And Darren Nathan, our friend at London Square, old friend of Three Fox, has added a bit of chat to remind you about your fantastic scheme, 200 odd homes at West Croydon as well. So yeah, investment definitely coming forward. Chris, do you want to pick up on some of those points, and let's spend 10 minutes talking about what the construction industry would most benefit from, what would be most helpful in terms of what councils can do. And I'm afraid you've got the sort of burdensome job of representing the entire private sector here today. And we have to bear in mind that not all firms are as large or well-resourced as Wilmot Dixon. And obviously that the picture changes very much for many of the sort of smaller contractors. So what in your view can councils do to help?
But just perhaps to start with what probably are the biggest challenges for all construction businesses, which is about maintaining the social spacing on projects, and how actually one of the biggest challenges is making sure you've got enough welfare facilities for people on sites. That that is actually one of the biggest pinch points that we're finding in operating a building site. So, you know, we've got extra canteens going. We've even got marquees on some of our projects now to try and, so there's actually facilitating and providing enough space, you know, adjacent to or on projects such that additional accommodation can be put in because while we can shift canteen usage, there's only so much time you can gain by doing that. One of the other areas that's causing us difficulty is actually people getting to and from work. You know, we've encouraged people to drive so they're not on public transport. You know, with a lot more people coming back to work as of yesterday, the roads are suddenly going to get busier, and it's actually provision of parking space. So provision of parking space such that people can travel to and from work by car and avoid as much as possible using public transport would also be of benefit. I think not being too burdensome on projects. One of the things that we've found during this time actually is that if we focus very closely in planning on what we do, such that we keep trades apart on a project, actually they're producing more, and actually we can maintain the turnover that we need to do because we're planning better. And one of the things we've had to do as a business, and I'm sure others would find the same thing, is actually not be overly persistent on trying to get reports on everything. You know, everybody suddenly is very, very interested in precisely what's happening. You know, people know how to run construction sites, and yes, they should be inspected to make sure that we do maintain social spacing, but let's not overburden and add more regulation to what we do. So there's a bit there about, I would encourage you not to put more controls in place than you had before. Moving to one of the other factors that has affected progress actually is material supply. So a lot of manufacturers closed down during during this time because housing shut. You know, a lot of the plasterboard manufacturers closed their factories. One of the hard things to find at the moment is glass. So because factories have closed down, you can't put glass indoors, doors can't get manufactured. So there's a few things in the supply chain where I think encouraging manufacturers to up production would be really, really helpful. And then I think the big thing for us actually is, you know, I genuinely feel in control of what I have on sites, and I'm sure all other contractors feel that. You know, I visit my sites and my teams, and I feel more comfortable on a building site than I do in a supermarket, because there's a good level of control there. And the people who are in there, there's actually a weird thing that that COVID's brought about is a greater level of cooperation and collaboration. I really feel that people want to make things work, which is a brilliant thing. And if we can, and I'm sure local authorities feel the same thing. For me, the biggest thing is actually about the future and not today. I can manage today. It's stuttering pipeline. That's what makes me nervous. It's things, planning committees not taking place, or so things aren't going through the normal gears and machinations that normally happens. That's what worries me more. Is predictability of the future. Is as Sharif has said there, you know, will commercial schemes change? Will the future change? But in such a way that we just stutter and we don't make decisions now that mean that projects don't come in on stream. And that for me, you know, project continuity is my lifeblood. If I can't procure and be on site and be building, then that is difficult for me. It means I'm not employing so many people. It means that we're not making our contribution to the coffers of UK PLC. So
right.
Keeping things moving and there's ways and means, contractual, there are better ways of procuring than trying to take advantage of a difficult situation. Collaborating with us, getting things going would be a really good thing. Toby, I could take up the last half an hour.
Chris, no, that's lots and lots of threads for us to pick at. Thank you very much. Councillor Ferry, if we can come back around our circle. Keith, what would you like to pick up on any of those in particular? And I guess the last point that Chris raised there, are there any ways in which local authorities can work on procurement processes to ensure a sort of steady flow of development projects through the system?
Yes, I think it's not really a local authority function, but because we have, as I mentioned, regular meetings with lots of developers, and we know the developers in our area, we have been able to bring some of those developers together because, as Chris says, there is a problem with the supply chains, but some developers are finding other methods of getting supplies, which is useful to other developers. So getting developers talking to each other, not only just in Harrow, but throughout London, can quite often, it's an innovation because, councils don't normally talk to each other. Developers don't normally talk to each other. Contractors don't normally talk to each other. They like to think that they can carry on in their own little sphere, but being able to facilitate bringing people together to solve these common problems, I think, is one of the great things that has come out of this sorry crisis.
Great, thanks very much.
And also take what Chris said. I mentioned it briefly, but we've got to make sure that our planning department carries on working, and it has been all the way through. Quite how it's happening, I don't know, and I don't really want to know, but nobody's complaining to me that they're not getting the usual standard of service. We had to cancel the planning committee meeting last month because we hadn't got the technology, but we're going to carry on with planning committee meetings, but be it virtual or eventually going back to where we were before. I think this is one of the essential things that councils can do, is to make sure that there is no hold up from our side in the planning process or the building control process. Yeah,
thanks a lot, Keith. Pat, public sector is responsible for 40% of construction turnover. So what can be done in answer to some of Chris's points?
Well, I think Chris is in the lucky position. He's got at least one very good client who's keeping planning running and will keep building his pipeline as long as he can hit the right prices. And he's in a very fortunate position of being on a very, very good, I think, framework of tier one contractors to build out our pipeline. So possibly if everyone else was like us, he'd be in a very secure position. But I think, being serious about this, I think there are a number of real challenges in terms of, and one is something which we haven't mentioned, which is Brexit. And that if you think where we are with supply chain disruption, as Johnson seems set on a no-deal departure from the EU at the end of the year, we're now in a position where people have used up some of their stocks that they'd set aside for Brexit. We've been in this issue with, say, the supply of plasterboard in the run-up to the not departing in previous years. So I think there's a real issue there about the impact of Brexit on import, export, supply of labour, and particularly the supply chain, which we're going to have to start to get to grips with quickly, because that will hit us as soon as we possibly start to come out of the current COVID problems. And I think the real issue around supply chain there. In terms of keeping stuff going, yes, we ran a socially distanced planning committee, then we ran a virtual planning committee, and we'll carry on doing that. So those process functions, I think local authorities, certainly in London, I don't know about elsewhere, have really stepped up in terms of keeping that going. We, I think, are all committed to keeping our own build programs going and expanding those where we can. We certainly, and I know others are, looking for extra money from government. And I think this is where government really can step in to help the sector and keep people like Chris going and keep their cash flow working and everything like that, by putting now money into the the public sector to keep construction going, to take forward some of those currently stalled sites and those others. You know, we have intervened in sites with direct loans to private developers to date. You know, we're in a position to do more of that. If, for example, you know, we were given interest-free loan facilities from PWLB, we could do more of that. So, you know, there's a lot of scope. I think that some of the other issues are really difficult. I mean, I think transport is one that really stands out as being a problem. You know, the irony of encouraging people to drive in the middle of a respiratory illness outbreak, which has clearly hit big urban areas much harder. There may be other reasons, but it's clearly, you know, one suspects that air quality must be a factor, is counterintuitive. Clearly, the tube, as currently constituted, you know, to run the London Underground socially distanced, you're about 15% of capacity. You know, so there are real issues around transport and what we do there. You know, reallocation of road space. I think this is a big opportunity for us all to start to think much more about reallocating road space to walking and cycling. Because though people always give an example of someone who makes a 30-mile commute, and someone used to make a 30-mile commute by bike, I'm probably not the right person to talk about this, but you know, most people commute less than 5 miles, even in the southeast. So, you know, there's an awful lot more we can do about helping people to get to work in a more sustainable way. And I think that's a challenge for the GLA, local authorities, and for central government. And central government have got to seize the opportunity, I think, around that. And that in itself actually would generate an awful lot of work for the construction sector. If you think about it, you know, how did Roosevelt get America out of that depression in the 1930s? It was through the New Deal, which was around public works. So, you know, part of our public works New Deal doesn't have to all be road building. It can be the reallocation of road space. Why can't we invest more in, you know, in additional public transport capacity? Suddenly, you know, when you've got a socially distanced railway, HS2, which is about increasing capacity as much as reducing speed, seems very sensible. Crossrail 2, ditto. You know, all these projects that you start to think, you know, this is the opportunity, would provide a big injection for the construction sector and everything that goes with it, but would also provide increased transport capacity. So we're not in this ridiculous situation where you're used to travelling to tube with your face pressed against someone else's nose, which is clearly not healthy on any level, whether it's COVID, flu, or, you know, any other myriad of illnesses, you know. So setting aside the pleasant stuff. So I think there are lots of things the public sector can do. We now need to start to think very creatively. You know, some of us have been doing lots of very creative stuff in terms of borrowing, investing, buying sites, working with developers and joint ventures. But I think, you know, if government really got behind that, rather than talking of unwise investments, and actually said, you know, yes, we want the public sector to get involved here because that is the way to keep the construction sector going, then I think there's a lot to be done.
Great stuff, Pat. The idea of interest-free loans from PWLB to support developments is a tantalising one. Shifa, I've been talking to your planners about all their fantastic plans to expand access to cycling and walking in Croydon. So that's clearly one of the ways in which you're going to help. But there's no money available, right? And TfL is all on furlough. So how much can you actually intervene to support Chris and other construction companies in these ways?
So I think, and firstly, sorry, Darren, for not mentioning London Square. Apologies for that. I think you're absolutely right. I think Croydon are fortunate to a certain extent because they do have and still have what's known as the growth zone, which was an infrastructure fund of 500 million for a lot of public realm improvements and infrastructure, including sustainable infrastructure and cycling and walking routes. And we can draw on that to continue to do some of those things, because you're right, at the moment, there are problems with, you know, what were previously funded through TfL, and there is uncertainty around that funding going forward at a time when there is more need and demand for those sorts of sustainable routes, given the challenges that we face. So I think we will tend to draw on the funding that we've got at the moment and try and use that. I mean, there is a boundary for that infrastructure, which is central Croydon, where all the development is going on. But nevertheless, I think that's a start in terms of just pump priming and making sure that some capital works continue to happen. Other than that, I think all local authorities are going to have to start thinking about other ways of funding these sorts of works. And I think it goes back to what Pat says. And again, at a strategic level, how are the government going to respond to the economic crisis? Is it going to be encouraging local authorities to spend more? Because we all know construction drives the economy, whether that be housing development, schools, roads, whatever that is, and what comes out of that. Because I think, you know, there's a huge amount of uncertainty, but when you are in these sorts of recessions, spending money, and again, history has shown us public sector spending money is often the start of some sort of recovery. And I think there'll be other opportunities that hopefully will come out of that.
Do you see one of the questions that the viewers have been asking is around modular construction? Do you see a particular usefulness for offsite manufacturing in helping to get construction going?
Well, certainly before COVID, the view was that one of the benefits of modular potentially was, because this is again pre-COVID, where the challenges were more about labour and Brexit and the fact that we weren't going to get enough construction workers. And there was certainly a view expressed that the way in which modular construction happens, which is basically in a factory using technology, would be more attracted to some of our younger people about choosing a career in construction than it's being seen as a dirty job on a building site, which is, hasn't been particularly attractive to our young people in the UK. So certainly, and I think there is something in that around seeing it as a different sort of profession. And I think now on the whole COVID-19 thing, because I think the question was, is it going to be safer? Well, again, thinking about working in a factory situation, which is probably easier to control than a building site, then it could potentially be a safer way of working, as well as a cleaner way and potentially a more attractive way for future generations when they decide on careers in construction or otherwise. So I think it has got a lot going for it. I don't think it's any cheaper. That's certainly what we're hearing. So it's not something that if you do it in modular, it's any cheaper, or that it doesn't have the design quality, because otherwise I don't think we would support it. But certainly in terms of thinking about the future for construction workers, I thought it's certainly an opportunity to attract more young people and other people into construction as a career.
What's your take on that, Chris?
I think modular has pros and has cons. The pros are, once you're onto site, things proceed more quickly. You do have more control in a factory. You have got to commit to it a lot sooner in the process. So the design process and then the manufacturing process means it's off-site longer, but on-site more quickly. So from a COVID perspective, I think you're right. You can control the factory more closely. You can also control quality and things like that more closely. So there are positives in that respect. I don't think it will unlock the pipeline more quickly because it's a relatively slow response, and also the capacity in the off-site industry is not that big relative to what the construction industry turns over. So I think it has niches. I think it has certain aspects that it's absolutely right for, and then certain aspects that it absolutely isn't right for. So I think it's a sector within a sector that will be beneficial used in the right way.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Viewers, thank you all for your questions, which are pouring in. They're fantastic. I think reading through them that the panelists have answered in their presentations, quite a few of them. But Pat, there's one here. It's an anonymous question, which usually spells trouble, but I don't think it's particularly contentious. Council frameworks and tenders and development opportunities. Do you foresee the programme continuing as is, or is it likely to slow down due to uncertainty or slower progress on site?
No, I mean, I think that we have a pipeline of work which has been delayed because we're working slow. We've got to catch that up. So on our own direct build program, it's going to be a catch-up exercise. If there is some post-COVID money from GLA, central government, going in, then that'll speed that up. So that we'll be putting more work out rather than less work out. We'll certainly be putting the same amount out. In terms of we're not an authority that disposes of sites, so we tend not to be doing procurement exercises to find development partners, because we tend to be buying sites rather than selling. And I think we will probably be post-COVID doing as much buying as anything else, because we'll be buying into schemes, either that buying units, buying partly completed schemes, investing in existing opportunities. But I think that if government gets this right, then you should see local authorities actually moving stuff forward faster. There will be a delay, there will be process delay. I'll abuse my position here, and that I would just go on back on Chris's question around answer around MMC. And I think that, you know, MMC does offer huge opportunities long term for the construction industry, but the construction industry has got to grab this. And if you go to Scandinavia, you see all the major contractors do it, all their offsite, you know, everything is done largely offsite and then brought to site, and that's their standard way of working. And the reason that MMC hasn't caught on in the UK still, and it's still a very small part of the sector, is because the major contractors haven't embraced it. And I think this is the opportunity for the major contractors to really embrace MMC, and for the big boys to actually buy up and or create their own off-site manufacturing facilities to supply their ongoing activities on site. And I think that's the interesting thing post-crisis. Is this the opportunity actually to say, yes, we do need to embrace more modern methods of working, which isn't the old school building site with everyone shouting at each other and, you know, generally a fairly hostile environment, discipline-wise, everything else, with lots of subcontractors not paying tax, all these sort of things. You know, this is the opportunity, if we are going to really take things forward, to move to a system which is much more factory-based. But you've got to get the major contractors into that. Otherwise, the argument will be it doesn't fit with our business model, and MMC suppliers are outside that central procurement function and outside that central supply chain.
Chris?
I don't like the picture that Pat paints of a modern construction site, because that isn't a modern construction site. A modern construction site is more like a factory than it has ever been. So I agree. Perhaps when we started 35, 40 years ago, that was what a construction site was. I entirely agree. It has its place, and we are embracing and trying to standardizing product, whether it's standardized product built offsite or on-site, is a great thing. So standardizing detail and how buildings come together would be a massive step forward. I want to be building more modular and unlocking that supply chain. To be able to invest in a factory that's doing it, you've got to have a pipeline that wants it as well. And that's about, for me, that's about, you know, cars are very, very similar, aren't they? There's lots and lots of similar product. Construction, the requirements of construction are still very diverse, and we if we can get to a place where we have more commonality than we do difference, that would be a major step forward.
Okay, well, let's put that to Councillor Ferry. Keith, can you foresee a future in which local authorities are specifying products more rigidly, so that off-site manufacturing can benefit from a kind of standardization across the development field?
Yeah, obviously what Chris says, the more standardized that we can have on our own projects where we're completely in control of the design. Although we've got 2 or 3 different architects working on them, we've always pointed out that they've got to look not exactly identical, but they've got to have the same form of construction, so that we can have the economies of scale when these things are built. I mean, we don't. The reason we've got 3 architects working on it is because we want 3 different design perspectives, but we also want to make sure that everything works together. And also it helps out when it comes to the maintenance of things. If you've got the same boiler, let's say, in all of your properties, then you only need to have one skilled person to maintain all that. Boilers is probably a bad example because we're going to district heating systems. But if you can rationalise and stop the architects going too far down their own road of individualism, if you can standardise these things, there's benefits not only for construction but for maintenance and further upkeep of the equipment.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Keith. We've got a question. We're out of time, sadly, folks, and we've got a question here about hot decking. I thought that might refer to working practices from home during the summer months as the sun comes out and we all sit out in gardens, but I think it might just be a typo. But we don't sadly have time to answer it. I've got to end the session so that you can all get on with your busy days, and it's my commitment to you viewers is that we won't take up more than an hour of your time, and also to the panelists who are extremely busy. Local authorities have never been busier. So thank you very much for an absorbing and wide-ranging and really well-fueled by questions discussion. And I hope you've all been able to take something useful from today. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers and assume that everybody around the country is applauding now virtually, to thank them for taking their time to discuss these matters with us today. And thank you viewers for your attention and your questions. Don't forget tonight at 8 p.m. when you're applauding the NHS to spare a thought for council employees who are around the country, also on the front line of keeping people alive during this crisis, and very much unsung at the moment. You'll find a recording and report of this session at the voiceofauthority.co.uk sometime tomorrow when we've got through processing it, along with well over 120 fascinating interviews with top people at councils. Our next session, next Thursday at 11 a.m. What does recovery look like for the core cities? Very much hope you can join us then. Until then, goodbye from us and from all at 3 Fox. Goodbye.
Thank you, Toby.